Desesperado.
Desperate. The corruption scandal in the government of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has led to another resignation in the presidential cabinet. Andriy Yermak, head of the president's office, none other than Zelensky's right-hand man, submitted his resignation following explicit revelations of his involvement in a massive corruption network worth billions of dollars. Zelensky appears cornered. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 298 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up, a like against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and of course also through our PayPal account. Joining us on the other side of the screen, and the other side of Europe, from Madrid, Spain, is Mr. Fernando Moragón. Hello, Fernando. How are you? Everything good over there?
Moragón, hola Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Well, just to add that if anyone wants to make free donations of several million euros, we have no problem with that. That said, let's see over here. Well, this Europe is becoming more and more decadent, more outdated, more pathetic, with absolutely idiotic politicians. I suppose you've already had the chance to talk about our dear Kaja Kallas saying, "We must disarm the Russians," and so on. Ma'am, you're mistaken. The ones who are losing are the Ukrainians. How are you going to disarm the Russians? How are you going to bell the cat? Anyway, these delusional things, right, from Kaja Kallas saying, because the Russians have attacked 19 countries in the last 2 centuries. We're saying, which 19 countries? Tell us, explain it to us. In other words, it's actually been the other way around. Well, what does it matter? Reality can never ruin your story, your narrative. That's the least of it. So here we are in this mess. Europeans are currently going crazy, out of control, of course terrified because the war is ending for them. They're running out of war. That's the problem. And they're going to run out of war because, as we'll discuss in detail, 2 of the possible causes of collapse, there are more, but anyway, are already there, let's say sparking. One is military and the other political. And as you rightly pointed out, Yermak's right-hand man, Zelensky. Oh no, sorry, it's the other way around.
La mano derecha de Yermak, Zelensky, digo, ay, no, perdón, que es al revés. No, es verdad, es decir, a ver, tal cual, Zelensky...
No, it's true, let's see, just like that. Zelensky was Yermak's puppet. Yermak was the gray matter, the one who did the thinking, so to speak. And this, if I remember correctly, back in his non-political acting days, well, when he was just an actor, he was his producer, so the one who directs, who controls, who sets up the whole show. Well, Yermak has been forced to resign, or he's been dismissed, depending on how you look at it, because of the statements he made. But we'll get into that now. And Yermak's fall is, well, something like if... I'm trying to think of a historical parallel, but nothing comes to mind. Something like when Godoy fell. Charles IV didn't really matter. What mattered was Godoy, that is, the one who was sleeping with the queen. This is well known.
This is Mr. Andriy Yermak in one of the many propaganda videos released by Ukraine throughout the war, in which Zelensky always appears, there on the left, accompanied by Yermak. Here we see him receiving Kiskello, who until very recently was the US representative in Ukraine. Formerly, this man held the highest position below the president, head of the presidential office, something like a chief of staff. But, As Fernando emphasizes, for many people, although this man was formally below Zelensky, in practice he was actually above him. Fernando, is that true?
Efectivamente, vamos, yo soy de los que pienso que realmente era el cerebro gris.
Indeed, I'm one of those who think he was really the mastermind. That is, Zelensky isn't very bright, and the one running the whole operation was Yermak. To the point that let's not forget, and we'll have time to talk about this later, this is where the internal struggles within the Ukrainian regime intersect with the external ones regarding the regime and its sponsors, mainly the British and the Americans. Yermak has been the British man from the very beginning. That is, even when Zelensky, who later switched sides, was the Americans' man, this one was the British man. So this is a very hard blow to the British agenda, which, let's not forget, is not the same as the American one, especially now. In other words, this has tremendous consequences, and we're going to feel them. And let's not forget that the one who had been negotiating lately, well, both lately and at the beginning, really, the one negotiating directly with Marco Rubio, with one person, with another, and so on, was Yermak.
Con Marco Rubio, con uno, con otro y tal, era Yermak. La penúltima reunión, bueno, que tuvo...
The second to last meeting, well, the last one Marco Rubio had, wasn't recent, but one of the more recent ones. It was with Yermak, before he presented the 28 points, which later became 19, then 22. We don't even know how many points there are anymore. Anyway, it was Yermak, meaning this man was the one really in charge. I want to recall that he was also, I'm not sure, you see, I think he was also part of the delegation the first time the Americans and the Russians met. No, Ukrainians. But the first meeting with the Russians. No, I mean, when the Americans meet with the Russians, with the Eurof and so on, then the Ukrainian delegation that meets with Marco Rubio and others, I think that, besides the foreign minister, Yermak was also there. I'm not sure, but I think so. I mean, a man who was everywhere and was the one really running the country. Because Zelensky doesn't have what it takes. Zelensky was the actor, literally, that is, the political actor who was the face of it and who, let's not forget, was the actor they put forward to win an election. And the one behind it was Yermak, that is, apart from the Western powers, etc., but it was Yermak who was directing his campaign, and so on. In other words, the key man of the regime, the strong man, at least as powerful as Zelensky. Some called him the Grey Cardinal, meaning the Eminence Grise, the one behind the Pope, right, the Black Pope. Well, although the Black Pope would be the one of the Jesuits, but anyway, that's another story. But as I said, extremely important. And we'll get into that now. Why does he fall? What's the final element that leads Yermak to disaster? Apart, of course, from corruption. But let's say the latest statements that make the Americans angry and say, well, that's as far as we go. Because let's not forget something. Those two Ukrainian anti-corruption organizations were created by the United States, are controlled by the United States, and have only opened corruption cases that the United States was interested in. In other words, this case was opened, the whole issue of corruption in the energy sector, etc., because they wanted to go after Zelensky's inner circle and take them down, as they've been doing. And now they've gone after the biggest figure, Yermak, and took him down. In other words, the Americans have just scored a huge point against the British by taking out Yermak.
Let's remember that the relationship between Zelensky and Yermak, his right-hand man, and, as Fernando points out, possibly the dark monk operating in the shadows of the Ukrainian government, didn't begin recently, but a long time ago, even before Zelensky launched his political career, when he was still working in the media as a comedian and, if I recall correctly, as the chief producer of a television channel. This other man, Yermak, appeared as a lawyer and also as the founder of a film studio. That's where they met, built a relationship, and began working together in the media, including series and films at the famous Kvartal 95 studio, responsible for the television series starring Zelensky, which practically catapulted him to the presidency and marked his entry into politics. In that very series, if I'm not mistaken, he played a high school teacher.
Yes, he became president.
Of course, against corruption, if I remember correctly, with a public episode of outrage against corruption. That generated a lot of popularity for this high school teacher in the series, and from there he began a very rapid rise toward the presidency. Suddenly, the government of a man of the people was being portrayed. And behind this image and this highly popular series in Ukraine, Yermak appeared as one of the people responsible for the studio in charge of the production. That relationship had already begun back then, and really between them, whether as friends or as accomplices. We've shown a very close relationship between the two, because from that moment on, he accompanied him up to this day as Zelensky's right-hand man, now president. The story between them is almost cinematic. And now, this corruption scandal that's affecting more and more members of Zelensky's cabinet, and perhaps soon Zelensky himself, has led to Yermak's resignation and Zelensky's announcement of a reset of his government. That's what he called it, Fernando, a reset of the government.
A reset. By the way, the famous series that catapulted Zelensky to stardom was called Servant of the People. And well, we've already seen that the series could have a sense of servant of the people, but nothing like that in reality. Just like his party, right, Fernando?
Like the party, ultimately Zelensky's party. If I remember correctly. Yes, I think so, because that's how I understood it.
Yes.
Sometimes, depending on the translation, they call him servant of the people, or servant of the nation. Servant with an S, right? Like a servant in feudal times, something like that, yes. Straight out of a movie. And in the meantime, why all the fuss about these back and forths? In Miami, just minutes ago, this situation, let me go back a bit. Here, gathered in Miami just a few minutes ago, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. To his left, Steve Witkoff, Trump's representative for all his affairs, his personal envoy. To the right, Trump's son-in-law, exactly his daughter's husband. And on this side, on our side, further ahead, a bit lower to the right, the Ukrainian delegation taking part in negotiations over Ukraine's possible capitulation. Pay attention to what just happened moments ago.
The end goal is obviously not just the end of the war, obviously that's central and fundamental. We want to see the end of the killing and the death and the suffering, and I'm sure the Ukrainian side, I know they do as well.
The ultimate goals, obviously, are not just the end of the war. That's central and fundamental. We want to see an end to death and suffering, and I'm sure the Ukrainians want that too. They want peace. But it's also about ensuring an end to the war that gives Ukraine sovereignty and independence and a chance for true prosperity. So this isn't just about ending a war. It's about ending it in a way that creates a mechanism and a path forward that allows them to be independent and sovereign, to avoid another war, and to create tremendous prosperity for their people. Not just to rebuild the country, but to enter an era of extraordinary economic progress. It's a country with tremendous economic potential. Well, this is where the laughter should come in.
Bueno, aquí deberían venir las risas, quiero decir. Pues claro.
I mean, well, of course, especially the part that says, no, this is more than a peace agreement. There has to be a future of prosperity, of blessings, and so on. You look at the faces of all the participants, of Witkoff and so on, of the Ukrainians, and you think, well, they don't even believe it themselves. I mean, it doesn't matter, even if the war ended tomorrow, even under relatively favorable conditions for Ukraine, Ukraine's future isn't bleak. It's worse than that. I mean, we've talked about this many times, and still, look, I think it's been more than a year since the first time you showed that famous population pyramid of Ukraine. We've often said, look, Ukraine has no future, no demographic future.
No tiene futuro. No tiene futuro demográfico. Es decir, Ucrania se ha acabado, es un estado fallido. Pero fallido.
That is to say, Ukraine is finished. It's a failed state, but failed and recoverable. I mean, it's over. So, well, I mean, of course, hearing here that they're telling us a fairy tale. No, we end the war, Marco Rubio, that one. We end the war and all that because we don't just want to end the war. We want Ukraine to have sovereignty, prosperity, everything, blessings and wonders. I mean, it's a joke. You just have to look at the faces of those who are there, completely serious, as if saying, what has Marco Rubio taken? What did he take to say these things? Because everyone knows this is over and that those famous 28 points, even though they have some rather odd ideas, the Russians have already said, well, forget it, this will have to be reviewed. Like the thing about the 600,000 men that the future Ukrainian army will have and all that. But anyway, it's basically a capitulation. That is, a surrender. A surrender under quite onerous, quite harsh conditions for Ukraine. A surrender that Yermak himself already hinted at after meeting with Marco Rubio. He made some statements to the Atlantic magazine where he already said that no, the main points would not be fulfilled. Zelensky is going to follow the same path. And the whole bunch that's there, now more than ever in the hands of the neo-Nazis, is going to say no. Because if they say yes, the neo-Nazis will slit their throats, just like that. Then, what Trump wanted comes true. That is, this peace plan is designed not to be fulfilled, so that the Ukrainians reject it, as they already have, so that they reject it again, and Trump can say, no, I tried, but the Ukrainians and the Europeans don't want to. There's really no need to overthink it. I mean, well, as I said, the images speak for themselves. Just look at their funeral faces. It's incredible. So, well then, but right now I'm telling you, the one who was supposed to lead that delegation at the time was Yermak, but since they got rid of him, the one heading the delegation was, let me tell you, the cowboy you see there. That one. Yes, Humalov, who right now holds a different position because they keep changing posts every other day. Until very recently, he was Minister of Defense. I'll tell you now because they've shuffled his position again. I have it here somewhere.
He is now the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, and until July 2025, he was the Minister of Defense.
Yes, how they change and shuffle things around. Before, there was Shmyhal or something like that, the one who was Prime Minister, and now they've made him Defense Minister. These things the Ukrainians do in their internal power struggles and all that. Well, they had to send this guy because Yermak was going to go, and they got rid of him. They sent this one, who, by the way, is also involved in the scheme. I mean, he's not going to last long either. Right now, in the basic corruption network, because they're all involved. There's the famous Timur Mindich, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, who's the one who organized the whole corruption mess. And there's Rustem Umerov, the bald guy we've seen, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, as you rightly pointed out. And there's Yermak, who's the one in charge. There are also, for example, the one who already resigned, the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Justice, a member of the National Commission for State Regulation of Energy and Public Utilities, the Minister of National Unity and the state-owned company, and also the Director of Finance and Budget of Energoatom, the main Ukrainian energy company. In other words, not a single one is spared. I'm only mentioning a few. Not a single one is spared.
No se salva ni uno.
Una pregunta, Fernando, sobre algo sobre lo cual querría tu perspectiva.
A question, Fernando, about something I'd like your perspective on. Meanwhile, by the way, here's the image of the cover of the series, Servant of the People, which the browser translates as Siervo del Pueblo, but Servidor del Pueblo would be a much better translation. Servidor del Pueblo, confirmed as a 2015 television series with this whole story, and also confirmed that the political party founded in 2017, just 2 years later, bears the same name. The party takes its name from the popular Ukrainian TV series Servidor del Pueblo, in which Zelensky played a fictional Ukrainian president. That's the significance of Zelensky's background in the media, and logically, of his connection with another media producer like Yermak before entering government. But I wanted to ask you the following question, Fernando. Why do Americans hammer so much on narratives, on stories? I remember, not so long ago, Marco Rubio himself making a confession in an interview. He literally said something like, "The war in Ukraine is a US proxy war." He presented it that way, with a hint of sincerity. However, after that, both Marco Rubio and Vance, Trump, constantly hammer on this idea of, "We are the mediators, this war should never have started, we want to save lives," and so on. A whole story, a narrative refuted not only by the facts, because if they truly wanted to save lives, they wouldn't be actively participating in a genocide like the one in Gaza. If they were really mediators in this war, they wouldn't have sponsored it from the start, and so on. Everything is for those who constantly project outward, who, despite all the obvious lies, are always building a narrative. In that context, this recent video from a group of Ukrainian representatives, on the verge of collapse, on the verge of defeat, and instead of calling things by their name, we're going to determine the terms of surrender, begins with this little story about wanting a spectacular Ukraine. It almost seems as if they started the war to create this spectacular Ukraine, doesn't it? Why so much emphasis? What's your view on this? Why so much emphasis from the United States on the narrative, on this little story, on this outward-facing tale?
Well, basically for 2 or 3 reasons. First, notice that they keep telling us, that's why Marco Rubio can say, no, this is a proxy war without any problem, because it's Biden's war. Let's not forget that. It's not Trump's war, it's Biden's and the Democrats' war, which means it's a problem Trump inherited and is trying to fix. The disaster, as they've always called it, the disaster Biden created with this war. In fact, one of the things Trump has repeated endlessly is, if I had been president, this war would never have started. So starting from that premise, right? Then they say, how do I get out of this war? Because what the Trump administration clearly understood, even before coming to power, once the elections were won and all that, is that this war is lost. In other words, there's no way to turn that around anymore. So then they say, okay, how do we get out of this war without it being too obvious that we've been defeated? Because the key point, and this is the serious part, is that what we are seeing and what we're going to see, and this will be the end of NATO, is the defeat, and this is extremely important, of a NATO war against Russia in Ukraine. That is, in Europe, which is precisely what NATO was created for. Because they could still say, well, we lost in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is very far away, outside our area, back when we wanted to become the world's police force and all that. But no, NATO was designed, of course, for a war against the Soviet Union in Europe. Well, against a smaller rival than the Soviet Union, Russia, which has much less power. NATO, with more members than ever, is going to be defeated. Yes, this is very serious. Trump doesn't care much about NATO. As such, he doesn't care much. But he has to get the United States out of the problem. And that's why he makes a deal with the Russians to become a false mediator. That is, the Russians agree and say, well, fine, okay, we accept, it's Biden's fault, the Europeans, the Democrats, and so on. A new administration comes in with very good intentions, and Trump wants to end the war. And then he places himself in a central position as a mediator, neutral, in quotes, even though he's part of the war and still is, still paying for weapons, intelligence, everything. But anyway, and the Russians play along. They say, yes, he's neutral and all that, whatever, and it's great, and we love the things Trump does and so on. Right? Why? Because the deal between the Russians and the Trump administration is as follows. Trump is going to buy time. He's going to act as if, in that mediator role, he were applying pressure, negotiating, whether he sends weapons or not, whether he stops sending them. And that's buying time. Let's not forget that, since he took office and picked up the phone to speak with Putin for the first time, many things have been done that have served absolutely no purpose.
Se han hecho muchas cosas que no han servido absolutamente para nada. Quiero decir, muchas cosas que no se han traducido en nada. Porque hay una cosa que es obvia.
Many things that haven't led to anything. Because there's something obvious, and the Russians have said it every which way in Aramaic and Martian. We have the points from June of last year, 2024, which are perfectly clear, well written, and this has to be fulfilled. And if this is fulfilled, other things could be negotiable, but this is not negotiable. That is to say, Zaporizhia, Kherson, of course Crimea obviously, but well, Donetsk and Luhansk in their entirety, including the parts currently held by the Ukrainians, go into Russian hands. That's not up for discussion. It's not even talked about. This is an absolutely taboo subject for the Russians, because they have held referendums, and from the Russian constitutional point of view, those territories are part of Russia, as Russian as Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Vladivostok. Therefore, Russia cannot leave part of its territory in the hands of the enemy, just as it didn't in Kursk. In other words, that is a necessary condition. The main one, the gentlemen of Ukraine cannot be in NATO, neither directly nor indirectly. That is, it's not enough for us that it's not formally in NATO. Right now, it's not formally in NATO. But in practice, NATO is there. I mean, they receive more aid, more weapons, more of everything than most NATO countries. Certainly more than the Europeans. That is to say, later on, neither actively nor passively, neither formally nor informally. No, that's the key to this whole mess, let's not forget it, NATO's approach toward Russia's borders. And the two other issues that are crucial. Demilitarization. This means that, well, fine, we accept, the Russians say we accept, that Ukraine can have an army, but a weak one. In other words, the numbers the Russians set as a limit are 85,000 troops. And of course only with light weapons. No missiles. No, not at all. That would also be negotiated practically weapon system by weapon system.
Prácticamente sistema de armas por sistema de armas. Podéis tener esto sí, esto no. Bueno.
You can have this yes, this no. And the third, or maybe the fourth, also extremely important, denazification. That means that the entire current ruling elite, who for the Russians are Nazis or neo-Nazis or collaborators of the neo-Nazis, I don't care which, that is from Zelensky to the leaders of the Azov battalion, all of that has to be wiped out. It has to disappear. It can disappear in many ways, but in any case it cannot remain in politics. And if that doesn't happen, the Russians will go all the way. And the end means the absolute defeat of Ukraine. And it's no longer about keeping Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. No, it will mean taking the entire western bank of the Dnipro, including Mykolaiv and Odessa. That's how clear it is. And an unconditional surrender by Ukraine. The destruction of NATO. And that's what Trump is playing at, because let's not forget that Trump is very uncomfortable with NATO. Trump, rightly or wrongly, thinks that NATO is already, and on that point I do agree, something dysfunctional, something useless, beyond pressuring allies to pay more for American weapons. But he can do that individually, that is, country by country. Let's not forget that Europeans are nobodies, laughable countries. And the pressure from the United States can be applied collectively or individually. It makes absolutely no difference to them. They're all going to say yes. In other words, we Europeans are not sovereign countries. Then, during his first term, he was already very reluctant and only agreed to maintain NATO because he was forced to by pressure. Of course, for that, they have to feed a narrative, a strategy of, I'm the mediator, I want peace because poor Ukrainians are dying so much and all that. He could say this just as he could say anything else. And there, he has to fight, and this is the key, not only against the Ukrainian regime and the crazy Europeans who are supporting that regime. The most important pressures are the internal ones. He's got the Democrats, who are all warmongers, and all the Republicans who aren't Trumpists, who are too. In other words, they're pressuring him and making public statements saying the war must go on and so on. We all know the nonsense Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican, let's not forget, comes out with. In other words, in favor of the war until the last Ukrainian, like Boris Johnson. That is to say, well, Trump has to, let's say, deal with this. He has to handle it in such a way that first, he does what's happening now. Let time pass. Because time works in favor of Trump and Putin. That is, the Trump administration and the Russian administration, Putin's. Why? Because the more time goes by, the worse the situation in Ukraine becomes. We're already seeing that Ukraine's situation is critical. Then, the pressure for the Ukrainians and Europeans to surrender grows stronger and more intense. The resistance of Ukrainians and Europeans becomes weaker, and on top of that, it allows the Russians to finish destroying any remaining capacity for Ukrainian resistance. We're already seeing that militarily. The situation is critical for Ukraine. In terms of energy, the situation is even more critical, if possible, for this winter. And now Trump makes the, let's say, master move, which is, he comes up with these 28 points, which are basically an unconditional surrender, with 2 or 3 points in favor, let's say, of the Ukrainians. But well, just so it doesn't look too blatant, knowing they're not going to accept it. Because among other things, in Trump's 28 points, one of them is the denazification of Ukraine. The Nazis are not going to agree to denazify themselves. That is, rats don't agree to de-ratify themselves. In other words, they don't poison themselves. No, unacceptable. And it's done so that they won't accept it, as indeed happened, as Yermak actually said. We do not accept that an army imposes limitations on our own army. We do not accept being forced to accept restrictions on joining whatever military or non-military organizations we want. That is NATO. And we do not accept, the other point was also, and we do not accept that the Russians keep part of our territory. In other words, the 1991 borders remain unchangeable. Because if Zelensky, Yermak, Humarov, or any of them says otherwise, it's their own neo-Nazis who execute them. And this, literally, because they've already said so. I mean, this has been said publicly in Ukrainian forecasts, that anyone who betrays Ukraine with any of these concessions gets taken out, just like that. So they have no other way out, and Trump plays with that, and I think he's played it quite well. Besides, he also uses it for domestic political reasons, to divert, let's say, the camera, the focus, when it suits him. That is, now that the Epstein scandal was rising again, which haunts him and he can't shake off, he stirs up the whole Ukraine thing, the 28 peace points and all that, and shifts the focus, and now everyone's talking only about peace in Ukraine, and not about Epstein. That is to say, this is also an internal strategy. But we can say that what he's doing is putting pressure on Ukraine, and that's what he's going to do next week. And look how he keeps dragging it out. He says, well, now he's meeting with the Ukrainians next week, I think this Monday. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, Wickoff goes there to talk with the Russians. He's already gone 6 or 7 times to talk. They don't even know what to talk about anymore. They must be talking about soccer, because they've already discussed everything. I mean, more theater. Then Wickoff will come back, tell Trump about it, and from there a new proposal and a counter-proposal, and we'll start discussing the points one by one. And we keep going with the same thing, and time goes by, at a dizzying speed.
I completely agree with your analysis, Fernando, regarding the facts and the reasons behind all this. But I wanted your perspective because, for me, what also shows up here, and again speaking of appearances, is that blessed background noise, that interference, just like last week, that beeping sound.
It's just that thing with the CIA. Why do they do it every time? Oh, Lord, Lord.
Yes, exactly. Not only in the case of Ukraine, but even in other matters where Trump, on the one hand, makes a statement or gives a speech expressing his desire for world peace, his ambition to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and in the next sentence announces a possible attack on Nigeria, Venezuela, Taiwan. Any absurd thing, right? But then, a moment later, it's as if he remembers again. Oh no, but I can't abandon the narrative of the United States as the good guys, the best, the peacemakers. Well, quite the opposite of reality, isn't it? I can't help but suspect that behind this contradiction, more evident in Trump's administration than in Biden's, because Biden's also carried out massacres all over the world, but with a little less brazenness than Trump's. So now, with Trump's brazenness, we're witnessing this contradiction in all its glory. On one hand, the narrative, and then this, our proxy war against the Russians. Or we say we want peace, and then they give Netanyahu a blank check to finish the job, basically bombing Palestinian civilians into the ground. To me, this partly has to do with the importance of the United States' cultural power. US hegemony at its height rested on economic, political, military, and cultural power. Cultural, in the sense of the narratives about the United States that were spread and accepted globally. Well, the economic might was abandoned long ago. China is by far the leading economic power. India, increasingly close to the United States, doesn't produce even a nut. They haven't completely abandoned production, but they have a financialized economy. Well, they lost economic power a long time ago. Political power. Well, voices are proliferating on a global scale. Multilateralism is emerging, and the best years of unipolarity are already in the past. Not that either anymore. Military power. Yes, it's still a major military power, perhaps still the leading one, but maybe not even that, with Russia and China advancing more and more. So the only remaining sphere of hegemonic power for the United States seems to be in the ideological, in the cultural, in the narrative. So yes, on one hand, they're getting more and more shameless in their desperation, but every now and then they remember, oh no, let's recall the Hollywood tale and start again with this no. We want what's best for Ukraine. We don't want deaths in Ukraine. But, shameless. If you're the ones generating the war, why insist on the narrative? That's how it feels to me. Maybe I'm wrong. And these people are also convinced of their own inherent goodness. And every so often, well, they say, oh, we're the nicest, the prettiest, the blondest, the whitest, and the ones with light eyes. And then a moment later, they're bombing Palestinians to pieces.
Yes, but look, I think we have to take two elements into account here. First, an empire in decline. This is no longer the empire that used to have that, let's say, kind of high-quality cultural domination. Quality in the type of domination, I mean, that is effective with a more or less coherent narrative and so on. No, this is already an empire in decline. And moreover, an empire in decline with a great sense of urgency because it knows it doesn't have much time left. Hence the haste, hence the urgency. This makes the narratives no longer well structured, and we end up with narratives that, from the point of view of any analyst, well, any reasonably serious analyst or non-analyst, are absurd. Like what you pointed out about the absolutely obvious contradiction of saying, oh, poor Ukrainians and Russians who are dying, we must stop this carnage, I'm shocked. But then, no, we can kill as many Palestinians as we want. Or the Israelis, whatever, no problem. They no longer have that ability to create coherent narratives like they used to, because it's an empire in decline and in a hurry. That's why we're seeing that there's no longer time to look for a mask to wear, a disguise to put on, and tell us a Hollywood-style story. No, there's no time anymore. Now it's just a matter of saying, hey, look, I know what I want is to attack Maduro because I want to take the oil. Period. That's it.
That is to say, yes, even when it comes to their own domestic politics. On one hand, they go on and on about freedom, the land of liberty and democracy in the United States, and then a moment later, Trump makes a statement about censorship of a certain media outlet, or calls another outlet fake news. The same with Trump as with Biden before him. Exactly the same. On one hand, we're the best in the world, and then, when they talk about democracy around the world and how great freedom is, and later, when protests against Trump begin, on his social network Truth, he posts this video of himself, made with artificial intelligence, flying a fighter jet and dropping excrement on the protesters. So, either it's the best democracy in the world, or it's a political regime where the president, faced with 7 million people protesting in the streets, responds with an AI-generated video of himself defecating on the demonstrators.
No, because they don't have, let's see, that general deterioration. It's like the aging process. When a very old person develops cognitive degeneration, like what happened to Biden, well, it's the same thing, but on a political level. That is, the ability of the United States to generate coherent, influential narratives that almost unconsciously penetrate the global population is also fading, just like its military and economic power. So they produce flaws, meaning contradictions, delusions, also the result of internal clashes among U.S. elites who are increasingly at odds with each other. So, well, there's no longer time to craft something coherent. I mean, to that we can add the quality of the politicians, the quality of U.S. politics. We see it in Europe too. We see Macron, Merkel, Steiner, and the others saying nonsense. Macron putting the map of Ukraine upside down and doing absolutely absurd things, saying that the Russians are very bad, terrible, and that we must, because the Russians have provoked 19 wars of aggression in the last 2 centuries. So against whom? They've been the ones attacked since Napoleon. At least they have. Well, even before that, since the wars against the Swedes, they've always been the ones attacked. What difference does it make? They tell you this nonsense. Or you get people like Callas saying that peace in Ukraine depends on disarming the Russians. Let's see, since when? Since when does the loser disarm the winner? Miss Callas, you have serious psychological problems. I mean, it's the other way around, always.
Here, Fernando, speaking of grotesqueries and contradictions, these are Zelensky's words, just minutes before the start of this meeting in Miami, with a Zelensky looking increasingly worse. Zelensky's words, literally I have the translation here. We are preparing to work next week with our partners to improve the quality of our air defense. We rely heavily on their support. This afternoon, US time, the Ukrainian delegation is expected to be in the United States and continue the dialogue based on the Geneva points, the meeting just shown. Diplomacy remains active. The US side is showing a constructive attitude, and it is very realistic to finalize steps in the coming days to determine how to end the war with dignity. The Ukrainian delegation has the necessary guidelines. I hope the team works in line with Ukraine's clear priorities. Pause here, pause here, pause here. Yes, yes, yes. With dignity. The speech and the reality, right? On one hand, the front is collapsing, the bombings are pounding strategic facilities all across Ukrainian territory. His right-hand man just catapulted out of the government for corruption, a delegation of grotesques sent because there's no one else. Basically, they're deliberating the terms of surrender and presenting it as a dialogue to end the war with dignity. Right? Once again, a delusion.
Claro,
Otra
que no
vez,
puede-
un delirio.
A ver, lo que no puede decir, porque el propio pueblo
Look, what he
ucraniano
can't say,
lo machacaría.
because the Ukrainian people themselves would tear him apart, destroy him. Let's not forget that unfortunately a large part of the Ukrainian people have believed Zelensky's lies and still believe them, is that they're going to win, that in the end they'll defeat the Russians, and so on. That it may last more or less time, but that victory will be theirs and things like that. Now, he can't just come out and say, look, we're going to surrender almost unconditionally. So he has to dress it up, remove forbidden words, and say, no, we're going to seek an agreement, a negotiation with dignity. Well, what is this with dignity thing? It's nothing.
Por suerte, en ese momento,
Luckily, at that moment, he didn't have an incident like the other day, shooting a little pebble of cocaine out of his nose, right? Because if at the moment of saying the word dignity, yes, dignity, he lets it out,
Of course, it would have already been done with dignity. Oh, excuse me. It's just that I've got a cold and all that.
bueno,
Bueno, no.
un poquito más del delirio de este señor, Fernando. Aquí termina.
well, a little more of this gentleman's delusion. Fernando here, wrapping up. Back to the delusion again. Moreover, our new sanctions will strengthen the pressure from our partners on Russia over this war. Our sanctions, which we will effectively implement together with our partners, will pressure the aggressor in the necessary way to weaken Russia's ability to wage war. The decrees will be published tomorrow. Our sanction proposals will be presented to all major partner jurisdictions. Thanks to everyone who helps. Thanks to everyone who defends Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine. Now there is glory to Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's sanctions against Russia will determine the end of the war.
Van a
Claro, no
determinar
quiero decir,
el fin de la guerra.
pues estos
también,
están en la narrativa con los europeos.
They're following the same narrative as the Europeans, meaning, no, we're going to impose more sanctions. But they've already been answered. Scott Tepperson, as we mentioned, already told the Europeans directly, look, you've imposed 19 sanction packages and it hasn't worked, and you want to keep doing the same thing. If it's not going to work, you failed. Stop doing this already. And then Zelensky himself said something in his previous speech, after the 28 points and all that, where he actually said something true. That is, we have to choose between, he didn't use the word surrender, I don't remember what he said, or losing a key ally, the United States.
O perder un aliado fundamental, Estados Unidos. Es decir, es que esa es la verdad.
That is to say, that's the truth, that's the dilemma. Either we surrender and therefore accept the Russians' terms, or we don't surrender and the Americans, the United States, stop helping us. They would keep helping them, but not as much. And even if they did help, it wouldn't matter, because they're going to lose anyway. In other words, we let the Russians finish the job, destroy the Ukrainian army, it collapses, and from there, well, the matter is over. That is, there's no longer a Ukraine problem because the Ukraine problem has been solved by the Russians through military means. Putin said it the other day. Well,
To top it off, this mention of sanctions. He would like more European and American sanctions, but here he announced a decree, tomorrow, of Ukrainian sanctions against Russia. Not long ago, he had also issued a decree for Ukraine to impose sanctions on the aerospace industry, specifically on the construction of rockets and spacecraft for Russia by Ukraine. What could this cause in Russia? A Ukrainian sanction on the development of the Russian aerospace industry. How many Ukrainian parts could there be in a Russian space station, Fernando?
Nada, hilaridad porque
nothing. Hilarity. Because on top of that, even before the war, the Ukrainians themselves had already destroyed a very powerful aerospace industry they had inherited from the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that the Antonovs were built in Ukraine. Let's not forget that the Zenit rocket was built in Ukraine. But all of that has been wiped out, so now they have nothing left to sanction with. Well, that's all. Look, you have to give the... I understand that seen from the outside. This is almost comical. But the thing is, the Ukrainians still believe it, unfortunately, or most of them do. I mean, and they did a survey among the most nationalist segment. Then you sign, and people said yes, 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 that we're going to win, and that we have to keep fighting the war against the Russians until the end. Well, these kinds of narratives, which seem ridiculous to us, are actually believed by a lot of people. And then they say, no, well, they're going to impose sanctions. They're absolutely irrelevant sanctions. It's like if I said I'm going to impose sanctions on Russia, on the United States, and so on, and from now on I won't buy Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whatever. Well, fine, don't buy it. It makes no difference at all. It doesn't affect anything. But you have to project that image of toughness, of imposing sanctions, even if you don't have any real sanctions to impose. So you keep feeding the fiction.
News from Miami. The US and Ukrainian delegations have left the meeting, the gathering. Here are Marco Rubio's first statements about what happened. This isn't subtitled yet because it just happened seconds ago. I'll do the translation.
All right, and I apologize because
Attention.
but I just wanted to update you. We had another very productive session building up.
Perdón por lo improvisado de todo esto, pero quería sencillamente...
Sorry for how improvised all this is, but I just wanted to give you a quick update on what just happened. We had a very productive session, following Geneva and continuing with the agreements reached this week. And, as I told you before, our goal here is not only to end the war, but to create a prosperous Ukraine. Well, that's all that's been made public so far, not even in mainstream media. Well, actually, they must have started the war because they wanted Ukraine's economic prosperity. No, not really.
But no, the fiction has to be maintained. The idea has to be maintained. And the problem is that then the entire Western press picks it up and says, oh no, Marco Rubio said yes, that things are moving forward, that they're prospering, and that, hey, there's been progress in the negotiations and so on. And they keep up the story, because that's what Americans want, to keep up the story, the narrative. No, I mean there's progress and so on. Well, now there's a stalemate, and after a short time they say again, no, but we've talked to some people or others, and now there's progress, things are resuming, and so on. This whole there's progress, there are advances, we're hopeful about reaching a peace agreement. Right now things are stalled, we're disappointed, sometimes with the Ukrainians, sometimes with the Russians, only to say again, no, we've talked to some, to others, and so on. And once again, there's progress, and so on. They've been saying that since so-and-so has been in power. In other words, it's the same story they always tell us.
Meanwhile here, without music, these images from yesterday, released by the Ukrainians themselves. This, a Ukrainian maritime drone attacking a tanker, that's what they call these oil or gas cargo ships, the tankers as they're called, off the coast of Turkey, in the Black Sea. In those waters, Ukrainian intelligence services carried out attacks against 2 tankers from the so-called Russian Ghost Fleet, both flying the flag of Gambia. Here are the images of the moment both ships were attacked. At the time of the attack, neither of these ships had full tanks. Both appeared empty. But even so, they caused a large explosion, and one of the ships, we'll show it in a moment, is now sinking, right? It's already partially submerged. The other one, for now, is not. What does this mean, Fernando, in your opinion?
¿Cuál es el significado de esto, Fernando, en tu opinión?
Más desesperación, es decir, han atacado, pues,
More desperation. That is, they've attacked, well, those tankers we're seeing, the explosions. And then the burning fuel isn't what they were transporting because they weren't carrying anything. They were empty. It's the ship's own fuel, the one they use to operate, which is an enormous amount. They're also doing it in territorial waters, well, I think in the Turkish exclusive economic zone, in any case, in Turkish waters. And it also affects Kazakh interests, because they also use the Black Sea to export their oil, since it's the easiest route, and they export it through Russia. 80% of the Kazakh oil exported to the West, and not going to China, goes through Russia. So well, the port area, which the Ukrainians have also attacked many times. It's a desperate move, trying to provoke something that creates chaos, stirs things up, and forces the Russians to respond. Because this, after all, is nothing more than an attack on Russian interests, and on top of that, in the Turkish area. But I think all these attacks are already very desperate. They know that Putin is not going to respond to this, and that the only thing capable of provoking a truly brutal, disproportionate Russian response would have to be something outrageous. The kind of thing like, we bomb a nuclear power plant such as the one in Zaporizhia, for example, or like the one in Kursk back in the day, or many others that exist, which can be attacked by drones, and in fact have been attacked by drones. But well, it would have to be hit with something tougher than a simple drone, so that the incident becomes so serious that the Russians are forced to respond in an extremely harsh way. Of course, the problem is that those behind this, well, the Ukrainians don't dare to do it without the sponsorship and essentially the direction of the British, who are right now desperately seeking provocation and, let's say, escalation. But of course, escalation that leads us to a nuclear war. So in the end, they're doing those kinds of things that aren't enough for Putin to say, no, we're going to respond. Especially now that he's already won the war. So in the end, these provocations remain just that. Things the Russians aren't going to respond to directly. They're already responding on the battlefield every day. I mean, doing something outrageous like, for example, bombing the Zaporizhia nuclear plant and contaminating half of Ukraine. Well, no, all of Ukraine, part of Europe and part of Russia. Well, no, because that would be too much. Besides, the Americans, having the perfect excuse, would completely abandon the Ukrainians, and then it wouldn't just be the Russians bombing them, it would be both the Russians and the Americans. I mean, it's already very difficult to find something on the part of the British Secret Services that could provoke that. Because let's not forget that among many other things, out of the 250,000 things the Westerners have done, mainly the British, though not only them, there is, that is, using the Ukrainians, the attack on the Russian strategic nuclear defense system. If the Russians haven't responded to that, which in the case of the United States, the response would have been brutal, savage. If they haven't responded to this, what would it take for them to respond? An even greater outrage.
Western media present these ships as part of Russia's Shadow Fleet, the famous Shadow Fleet in English, as an explanation for the Demolidors and Demolidoras for the audience. By the way, we're on our way to 3,000 connected Demolidors and 1,500 likes. Demolidors, Demolidoras, standing against censorship and the constant demonetization of our broadcasts. What exactly is the Russian Shadow Fleet, Fernando? Do these ships flying the Gambian flag actually represent Russian ownership?
No, what is the fleet in the shadows? In countries that generally have a very favorable fiscal situation, or where taxes simply aren't paid, and so on. So you find those countries like Gambia, which is, with all due respect, if you'll excuse the bluntness, a lousy country. Because look, Gambia's case is particularly, let's say, extreme. Why? Because in colonial times, the French came along and said, boom, Senegal. And then they said, boom. Picture the map here. The French settled here, and a bit further down, the French again. And then the British came and placed themselves right in the middle, just to be annoying.
y llegan los británicos y dicen, y nos ponemos en medio para fastidiar. A partir de ahí profundizan y se crea un país que si vemos el mapa...
From there they went deeper, and a country was created that if you look at it on the map, is very narrow, very small, but extremely long. An absolutely absurd colonial division, completely senseless. So of course they live off whatever they can. Look, the case of Senegal and Gambia is unbelievable. I mean, as I said, this came from the struggles to seize port areas in Africa. And there you have it. So notice, you can barely see it. It's like a little worm, so to speak, stretched out, because the British, in an area controlled by the French, suddenly stuck in their enclave. And then, as they went further inland, they kept going. The French controlled the vast majority of the territory, and the British advanced in an almost straight line, with the same dimensions, the same width of land. That's why we see such strange things in Africa.
La pregunta sobre la flota...
The question about the fleet in the shadows. But that's the level of Fernando's knowledge. He mentioned Gambia by chance because of the Gambian flag on those ships, and he can start a whole presentation on the history of Gambia. That's the level of knowledge. Fernando, a riddle. If you get this one right, you're the overall winner. Can you answer what the capital of Gambia is? Because I've never heard the name of that city in my life.
Since I studied all the capitals and so on, few prehistoric ones, because Senegal's is very easy, Dakar, but the one of...
Apparently, according to Wikipedia, honestly I have no idea, a city called Banjul.
But they also changed their names. I mean, one of the problems, no, it's true in Africa, a very well-known case, when decolonization arrives, Congo is created.
Yes.
Like the Republic of the Congo. Then Mobutu comes along and says, no, I don't like Congo, I'm going to call it Zaire. And when they finally get rid of Mobutu, they say, well, back to Congo again. So of course these changes make you completely lost. I don't even know who's who anymore. I mean, well, anyway, I remember when I was a kid, once I saw this huge ship, flag of who knows what. Monrovia, Italy, Monrovia. What's that? I looked it up. Liberia, the capital of Liberia. Liberia is a tiny country. I mean, a country formed by African slaves.
Americans, that is in the United States, freed.
Released and sent back there.
To Africa and founding a state.
But forming a state, so what happens then? Well, that's it. It has a series of tax regimes and so on that make you want to register there. That's why we see these massive fleets from those countries, and then maybe Germany's fleet has 5 ships. It's not that they only have 5 ships, they have a bunch, but they're registered in all those places. The same thing happens with Greece. Greece does have them, but Greece is another typical country that supposedly has a huge fleet, but it's not really Greek. They're just ships owned by ship owners from other countries that are registered in Greece because of certain advantages. That's why I say, well, yes, the shadow fleet. Well, look, this shadow fleet thing, everyone knows which ones they are, so it's not really shadow. Maybe it's because the ships don't sit in the sun when they dock and stay in the shade, because everyone knows who they are and all that. Within the industry, it's known which ships they use, what routes they take, where they're registered. And let's not forget that people look the other way. Be careful, because many of these shadow ships, part of the Russian shadow fleet, are used to transfer gas or oil in international waters to European ships. Or, well, ships that are European but registered elsewhere, but that are no longer Russian, let's say. They're a different kind of vessel and can freely enter the European Union without major issues. In other words, all of this is done knowingly. Why? Because let's not forget, we need Russian gas. There's no other way.
No, like it or not, because there's no other option. Yes, specifically, the Shadow Fleet basically represents a fleet of ships through which the Russians can carry out the export of their fuels, their energy, their oil, their gas. Despite Western sanctions, many shipping companies, in response to those sanctions, stopped doing business with Russia. Then, in their place, other companies appeared, not necessarily Russian, with other ships, and that's what the shadow fleet represents. That's what's called the shadow fleet. A real delusion, this idea of the shadow fleet. Basically, these are the ships that operate outside the sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe. Well, whether these ships are actually owned by Russia or by other countries, we can't.
Es verdad. No hay que olvidar que el horror vacui, es decir, que en
The horror vacuum, that is, in politics and economics, a vacuum is immediately filled. So if someone stops doing business in something, others will come along and do it. To give a well-known example, the big European companies, mainly German ones that used to sell Audis, Mercedes, and so on in Russia, when they have to leave, what happens? The Chinese come in full force, because the vacuum has to be filled. And right now, the Chinese are selling cars there in Russia like hotcakes. If it's not the Chinese, then it'll be someone else.
Let's take a more tragic example. When suddenly, in some country, in Mexico, in Colombia, or in the United States, they capture a drug trafficker, the head of a drug cartel. Shortly after, another cartel appears in its place, or another drug lord takes over, only that in between there are disputes over who will replace that figure, and that leads to massacres, right? One disappears, another appears. Of course, business is business. Exactly. Fernando, my friend, before we present the last topic related to Venezuela, I wanted to show some footage produced exclusively by Fernando himself. Yes, just today. Incredible. And by the way, once again I'm calling on all our supporters to join us with comments, thumbs up, and every possible interaction on the platform, because that helps spread our videos and supports us against censorship. Here are Fernando's images, never seen before, sent by him just a little while ago.
Not seen anywhere. I mean, this was recorded a few hours ago.
There.
This is the decline of the West.
Wait a moment, the platform again. This is Madrid, right? Now it's working, now it's working.
This is the decline of the West. Look at this wonderful dump near my street. A mix of neglect from public services and a lack of civility from the people. But this is how things are. Let's let these ladies pass, because this is a mess. And that's how it is. What's here is what we've got. The mess even reaches these little walls, as you can see. Some inconsiderate people left their coke, and I don't even know what this junk is. Well, this is how it is. Here we can see the Sunday dump. Because among other things, all this is overflowing, completely full. At least the cardboard bins are. This one, let's see, is for glass. Anyway, here's one last look at this filth. And there are still people who think that the West, and Spain in particular, Europe in general, are at the forefront of civilization. Because to believe that, honestly, you'd have to be really out of touch. And then we criticize the Chinese, for example, or the Russians. Just look at that. Really? What a thing. The Chinese, well, the Chinese see this and get scared, seeing how disgusting and decadent we Europeans are. All right then. Until next time.
Fernando, a question. Did you make this recording in Madrid or in Berlin? Because here, right outside my house, the exact same thing happens.
More of the same, right? No, in Madrid. But from what you're telling me, this could spread internationally within Europe. Well, that's how things are. And I still understand that the image we created a long time ago of that prosperous Europe of the welfare state where Germany and the Nordic countries were seen as paradise on earth, really stuck. And many people still have that vision of Europe. But that Europe stopped existing a long time ago. A very long time ago, really. So today's Europe is a Europe of poverty. But in situations like this, you see people rummaging around, trying to find food. I mean, really, and I'm telling you, this is near my street. I won't give more details because that would be, but I don't live in a poor area of Madrid in a poor neighborhood. I mean, I don't live in a shanty town or anything like that. No. No. I live in a more or less wealthy neighborhood. Well, yes, more or less. Just imagine if you go to the poorer neighborhoods where the services are worse. But this is the reality. You walk down the street, and there's this feeling of decay. You just have to look at people's faces. People's faces don't show happiness. There was a lady walking by saying, "What a disgrace."
Por ahí una señora pasando y diciendo, ¡qué barbaridad! Justo de fondo.
Yes, the poor ladies. That's why I stopped filming them, the poor ladies. You know, saying this is filthy, outrageous, indeed. Well, if you look at reality, this is what the European Single Party is achieving. Destroying education, healthcare, and public services. Let's not forget that in Madrid, public services are subcontracted to private companies. In this case, of course, the garbage collection system, well, municipal cleaning, but a good part of all these setups is contracted out to specific companies. Well, we can already see the privatized services.
Very expensive, extremely expensive, garbage collection. Every month, at least here in Germany, nothing municipal, all private companies. And every month, we shell out a huge amount of money for poor service, plus the added problem of people throwing trash everywhere. Are there a lot of rats in Madrid, Fernando, or not so much?
For now, I haven't seen many. In Madrid, I've seen rats, but quite a few years ago, and especially in the subway. In the subway, you would see one passing by. I haven't seen any in a long time. We're talking about the last century.
Fernando, in that sense then at the forefront, because he supports that mess with a false environmentalism that prevents public authorities from taking action against pests. For example, in the park on the corner of my house, when I go out to have fun with my 3-year-old son, him on his little bike riding around the park with me, we count the little rats every so often. Well, the little rats, these creatures like this, without tails. The African rat, the famous African rat. And we keep track of the rats that cross our path. I'm going to record it on video. I'm going to make a video, because this already seems extreme.
He tells it like that. What a phenomenon, how exaggerated. Sure, but no, yes.
In the end, with tenderness, the little mouse. Because she's a little mouse.
Yeah. Instead of feeding the pigeons, we feed the rats directly. Why bother with nonsense? Hey, and hunger. Instead of having a pet, a little dog or a kitten, we'll have little rats, right? I mean, with a collar and all, we'll take them out for a walk.
That is more environmentally friendly.
More ecological. But I'm sure it's much worse. Remember the images of... What city was it? It was Coventry, I don't remember. I mean, in England.
In the United Kingdom.
In the United Kingdom, that was already, well, a feast for the rats.
In Birmingham.
In Birmingham? Yeah, in Birmingham. Well, that was already everywhere. I mean, they had to go... I don't know, the police had to go straight in and shoot them with cannons because that was dangerous. Well, this is the reality of Europe. I keep saying, especially to young people, and look, I'm European and I'll probably end up staying for 1,000 reasons. But I tell young people, especially those who have a future ahead of them and all that, to leave Europe, to leave. Well, many have already left, but really they should go because the future doesn't lie in Europe. I'm telling you that, 100%. About other things I might say, well, I don't know. Maybe, probably. Just as I say, and we're going to be absolutely right about this, the Russians are going to win the war in Ukraine. We've been saying this practically since the special military operation began. Is it because the Russians are good? Because they're saints? Because they're taller, better looking, nicer, smarter? No. It's because of objective facts. When you start counting population, arms production capacity, weapon systems, and so on, you say, well, that's it, they're going to win. And on top of that, it's a nuclear power. Forget it. I mean, they can't lose. Indeed, they can't lose. It's as if, meaning Spain or France, or rather Andorra, went to war without an army against France or Spain. Well, they'd lose. And not because some are better or worse. It's just that we do the math, and it turns out it's impossible for Andorra to win. Well, this is the same. Well, like I said, Europe is going to become the most third world of the entire planet. Africa, in 20 or 30 years, will be 20,000 times better off than Europe. Look at what I'm saying. Africa, which is supposed to be the poorest. Well, in 20 or 30 years, Africa will be much better off than Europe. Europe will be the world's dumping ground, the trash that nobody wants. Only people who can't live or emigrate elsewhere will live here, if there's still time.
Yes. To top it off, it's sometimes surprising, the opinions of many people who live here, Europeans. It's surprising because if at any point they're asked about Africa, Latin America, or Asia, they immediately respond, oh no, because, oh yes, everything's dirty, everything. And meanwhile, rats are running underneath.
Well, that coexistence of that archaic supremacism with a reality still, yes, cultural and all that, because you come along with this idea of the cradle of civilization, the Greeks, the Romans, and then you go and say, no, I think the Greeks and Romans are fine, but that was a long time ago. There's very little of that left now, to put it mildly.
We're going to present the last topic after this moment. Here, Fernando, a few hours ago, Donald Trump's statement addressed to all airlines, pilots, drug traffickers, and human traffickers. We ask you to consider that the airspace over Venezuela and its surroundings will remain completely closed. Thank you for your attention, President Donald J. Trump. This is Trump's announcement from a few hours ago, almost from yesterday. Domestic flights in Venezuela still appear in the air, still active, flying across the country. 4 airlines are still participating in air traffic within Venezuela at this time. Beyond that, of course, a decision like this, and beyond how illegal and immoral all of this is, naturally generates nervousness. And here's the analysis on CNN from an analyst about this situation. Here, just a second. There we go.
How do you think we should interpret this?
What does this announcement by Donald Trump basically mean? And this man responds.
We should read into it that strikes are very probably going to occur over the course of this week.
We should interpret this as a sign that very likely, during the week, the United States will carry out attacks against Venezuela. This is a military expert. In 2 minutes, here's the name. Retired Admiral James Stavridis. That's the name of this former US officer. Let's show a bit more of his words.
If you think back to the Middle East...
If you think about the Middle East, you and I were discussing that a few months ago. The airspace over Israel and parts of the Middle East was repeatedly restricted.
If we think about the Middle East, which we were talking about recently, this situation was also seen not long ago.
Closed not only by the sovereign states there, but also from warnings from the U.S. and other entities. Same situation.
Closed not only by the sovereign states of the area, but also due to warnings from the United States and other entities. The same situation. We saw the same thing, not only from the United States, but also from other countries, with the announcement of the closure of Iran's airspace.
Commercial aircraft, Venezuelan air.
But I think it's the president's responsibility, if he's going to carry out airstrikes, to notify commercial airlines, whether Venezuelan or international, so they know they must suspend air traffic. whether it's with Tomahawk missiles, attacks, or Navy helicopters carrying Marines to the coast.
All of that creates a lot of complications in this.
All that causes, or would eventually cause, a great many complications in Venezuela's skies. That's why when we hear the U.S. president saying these things,
strikes are coming probably sooner rather than later.
That's why, to me, this means that when we hear the president saying these things, the attacks come sooner rather than later. And by the way, this video is courtesy of our brothers from Wars and Geopolitics. Up there, on the right, is the logo of the Wars and Geopolitics channel, in English, on Telegram. In my opinion, one of the best channels about geopolitics in Spanish. Everyone is invited to subscribe to that sister channel. Fernando.
¿Cuál es mi visión? A ver, este señor, por cierto, además de ser almirante...
What's my view? Let's see, this man, by the way, besides being an admiral, was also a general-in-chief. He was NATO's supreme commander. That's what it said. The guy, I mean, he's no low-ranking sergeant. I mean, come on. Considering Trump's mood swings, which also depend a lot on who he's listening to most at any given moment, right? If he listens more to Narco Rubio, sorry, I don't know what I was thinking, then obviously he's going to attack Venezuela. But if he's listening to someone more sensible, then maybe not. What is clear is this. Let's see. What I mean is that the United States has historically specialized in making absurd decisions from both a military and political standpoint. They've done it constantly, and that usually ends in defeats. So now that it's in an even more serious and worse situation, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they went for an absurd option. That said, of course, it's very hard to speculate about what they might or might not do. But let's assume they don't make an absurd decision. It all depends on which side of the bed Donald Trump wakes up on, and which advisor happens to be telling him the story that day. Well, let's see. The options they have are to invade Venezuela, occupy it, and install a regime favorable to Trump with some of those disreputable opposition figures who are in exile. This isn't just political fiction. It's beyond that. I mean, it's unfeasible. They wouldn't succeed. They'd end up defeated. So I rule out that scenario for now. You never know, but I'm ruling it out. Then what's left? The next more brutal option, doing what they often do, which is to throw the country into chaos through strategic bombings.
Muchas veces caotizar el país a base de bombardeos estratégicos. Hay que decir que por desgracia, si los norteamericanos se ponen...
It must be said that unfortunately, if the Americans start attacking the strategic facilities they consider, or political ones, or try to decapitate the country by attacking the presidential palace and so on, if they try that, they're going to scorch Venezuela. Because Venezuelans, despite the recent supplies from the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and others, don't have the capacity to face a power like the United States, which is also right next door. If they were farther away, maybe, but they're right next door. They might try it, a Libya or Syria type scenario. We throw this into chaos so no one controls it, and in the chaos, we gradually take control of the oil fields. There, for example, they send special operations forces or private mercenary companies, and they have control over that. They were already doing it in Nigeria. In other words, I mean, in Nigeria it's not exactly like this, but since oil gets stolen and, well, there are a lot of issues, they have private companies, American, British, etc., that are in charge of making sure Nigerian people don't steal oil from American companies. Well, something like that. I mean, it could be... I also think it's outrageous. Of course, it would mean devastating half of Venezuela. But anyway. Most likely what Trump is doing with this is applying pressure. That is what Trump wants. Through these measures that obviously create nervousness, they're closing the airspace. Will they attack? Won't they? What will they do? Is to put pressure on both the Venezuelan population and the Venezuelan government.
Tanto a la población venezolana como al gobierno venezolano.
And that, at some point, this kind of measure might cause Venezuelan generals to, well, switch sides and end up overthrowing the current president, joining, as I said, the other side, and then, well, they'd put one of their own, whoever it may be, in power there and control the country with U.S. support. Something like that, a bit like what happened in Syria, where in the end there were many factors, but one of the main ones was that most of the Syrian army generals who were supposed to defend Bashar al-Assad and Syria and all that were bought off by the opposition and either did nothing or directly switched sides. Something like that. In the meantime, you apply psychological pressure. And how do you apply psychological pressure? By doing that kind of thing. Because what can't happen, that is, Trump, after the escalation and deploying a bunch of ships, planes, missiles, and so on, can't just turn around now and say, all right, mission accomplished, we've ended Venezuelan drug trafficking, we've taken out 20 fishing boats, but we'll say they were drug traffickers and that's it, problem solved. That can't be. He has to at least achieve something he can present as a success. And while at the same time, he'll be putting very heavy pressure on the oil issue. That is to say, well, in the end, if they allow the current government, etc., to stay in power, it would be in exchange for making the concessions in the oil fields absolute, all of them. And let's not forget, it's not just that the Americans would take everything, it's that they would kick out the Chinese and the Russians, mainly the Chinese from Venezuela. That would be the other part. But as I said, that would probably be the most likely scenario. In other words, now I just go ahead and, since we do whatever we want, I close Venezuela's airspace just because I feel like it. Well, this kind of thing is already common in the United States. And tomorrow, well, I'll come up with something else. That is to say, tomorrow maybe I'll send the ships to carry out an embargo, or to lay mines and mine the ports, like they did in Nicaragua, to mine the Venezuelan ports, so that no ship can enter. Well, maybe that too. They've done this many times. It's about applying pressure, seeing how much the other side can take. I think that's the most likely scenario. But as I said, since this is America, meaning since the Americans see it as a kind of free pass and believe they have more leeway to do whatever they want there than anywhere else in the world, which is already a lot. Well, from what I'm told, from what I can gather, not that Trump's advisors are telling me, but still, the people who more or less have some information say that right now anything is possible. There's a group that lives in complete unreality and is ready to attack Venezuela. I think there's another, more reasonable group that's, well, trying to apply pressure, whatever, but not to the point of a military confrontation. It's going to depend on many factors we can't control. But I think the most reasonable thing from the standpoint of U.S. interests, that is to avoid getting burned, would be to pressure the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people to bring about a rupture.
Well, interesting analysis. Speaking of analysis and analysts, our friend and colleague Santiago Martinez is about to start his show in just 10 minutes. Santiago, how's everything over there? And what are you going to present on your show today?
Buenas noches, Ezequiel. Buenas noches, Fernando.
Good evening, Ezequiel. Good evening, Fernando. Tonight I have a show that I think people are really going to like. We're going to look at the attack on the supposedly Russian oil tankers, which aren't actually Russian, right? But since they belong to the shadow fleet, everything fits, from a rowboat to a tanker, doesn't it? We're going to analyze it, because it's not just about this war, about them hitting a Russian tanker, right? It completely changes the rules of the game at the international level. because even during World War II, not even the Nazis dared to attack ships flying neutral flags. They only did it almost in the last month of the war. They carried out a couple of attacks, but not even the Nazis dared to do that. And these new Nazis do it, don't they? And that really changes the game, even on a terrorist level. Because we're not talking about needing a submarine, a battleship, a Sukhoi 24. It's just a damn remote-controlled boat, right? Any terrorist with a bit of resources can build one of these boats and start attacking civilian ships, right? For example, in the Horn of Africa, as we're seeing, right? I mean, the rules of the game change completely at the international level. It's not a joke. In the West, they downplay it because it's in their interest to downplay the issue, right? Because let's imagine that Russia now decides off the coast of Greece, for example, to attack civilian ships because they're going to Ukraine. Just imagine, come on, they'd be declaring war on every country in the world. And then let's look at another very important fact, because as a result of what those people were saying, that Russia had attacked the whole planet and was the worst in the world, when in the last 100 years, Russia has been attacked many times, and if we go further back, even more times, right? And, for example, let's talk about when Russia was in the middle of a civil war, how 14 Western powers attacked Russia for years. It's not a joke, it's just not talked about here, but between 5 and 10 million people died in that war. I don't know where the Russians get so many people from. World War I, World War II, the Russian Revolution. If all that hadn't happened, today Russia would probably have 400 or 500 million inhabitants. I wouldn't be surprised, right? It would be enormous. And well, let's take a look at it from a perspective different from what traditional media tell us. Of course. As always, that's why we're on Demoliendo and DMP. And I think you're going to like it. I'll see you at 11. You're really going to like it.
You know, right?
What happened with Santiago is really interesting.
In 5 minutes, everyone will be there. A hug, Santiago, and see you soon.
Likewise.
See you later. In the meantime, Fernando over here, I completely agree with your analysis of Venezuela. For me, the possibility, or rather the likelihood of actions here and the magnitude of those actions will depend on US domestic politics. It's that simple.
Indeed.
According to the ups and downs of domestic politics, if it's Epstein, well, the midterm elections are still quite a ways off. But anyway, if it's not Epstein, then Charlie Kirk. And if not Charlie Kirk, what was the last one? The last one was Epstein, right? But there's always some little scandal around, some outrage, the clash with Marjorie Taylor Greene within MAGA itself. Well, that will basically determine whether they do something crazy here or not. Beyond the obvious nature of our rejection, I want to present it publicly, to somehow make a public statement of solidarity and brotherhood with the Venezuelan people in the face of this madness. That a president of one country decides, overnight, to begin concentrating troops off the coast of another country, to start bombing boats, so far the only confirmed ones being fishing boats, and even to order the closure of its airspace and issue threats of attacks or invasions. Well, this is the so-called rules-based world order, as they call it. Basically, the total and absolute dictatorship of the US empire, with the utmost brazenness, without any mask whatsoever. With everything, of course. Yes, I simply wanted to present it publicly, to emphasize once again, beyond the obviousness of our rejection and our support for Venezuela, that I wanted it said publicly. Fernando, whatever you want to add at the end, it's all yours, at your disposal.
No, a ver, nada especial, simplemente...
No, look, nothing special. Just This coming week, let's stay alert, because beyond the negotiations and all the show they'll keep putting on, the war goes on, and the Russian advances are getting bigger and bigger. The latest news might be that in Bolshansk, for example, the urban area has already completely fallen. Now it's a more or less wooded area with a few streets and not much else left. If you look, it's really battered. And everything points to the fact that in Huliaipol, they've already entered from two directions, from the southeast and roughly from the east, because Huliaipol is kind of a diagonal city, so to speak. Well, they're already inside fighting. That is to say, then, we're going to see very rapid advances, because among other things, the Ukrainians are in retreat. And the collapse, and this ties in, as we said before, with politics, is an explosive mix. Energy crisis, political crisis, military crisis, everything could blow up at any moment. Well, I mean that Jere, such a wonderful dump, guys. Ah, I thought you were going to launch a missile at the dump to get rid of it.
Sometimes this platform has that problem. When switching from one video to another, you can hear the audio of the new one, but still see the images from the previous one, until it reacts and the video starts.
I mean, look, it's a bit of a drastic solution, but it would get rid of the trash, I'm telling you. A bit drastic, huh?
The lady, huh? Over here, passing the signals to yes.
I mean, Mr. Dump, so wonderful, right? But he's not the only one. If we keep walking, we get to the next one and find something similar. And we go to another street and it's the same thing again. That's just how it is. What's missing is for people to say the same thing.
At one point, what madness over there.
Even the little dog moves aside. And that's how things are.
Well, dear Fernando, a hug demolishes both men and women. Farewell.
We're waiting on Wednesday for your video of the little rats in Berlin.
Well, me, committed to a video with the rats in Berlin. Perfect. Nothing difficult. Hugs. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Yeah.